If you're a milder case, mild moderate, the data is still not all in. Now, a lot of people feel better, and we think that's probably enough. We're still discussing, and there are studies out there to try and show that it has health benefits beyond feeling better, being less sleepy. Now, if being less sleepy means you don't drive into a tree while you're, on the road trip, that's a pretty dramatic health benefit. So I don't want to make it sound like that's nothing, but I just want to distinguish between what we know and what we don't know, what we think. And we think sleep apnea should be treated when it's mild and moderate. We know it should be treated when it's severe. There's also snoring, which is, if you will, the mildest form of sleep apnea. We don't know much about that. We know it makes people miserable, mostly wives of the snorer, or husbands of the snorer if it's the woman. We don't really fully understand what we're doing when we treat snoring in terms of improving people's non-medical conditions, and that's still an open question. We suspect there are some people who benefit from it. And all of this is still, being studied. I think the word is not out. The key point you want to take away from this point is CPAP works, it's important. And so now this question, why try to do better than CPAP? And I've already sort of hinted what I'm going to say. One is to do better, and frankly, I don't think you can. Because when you got something that works perfectly, there's no further improvement that's going to be possible. What you can do is you can try and make it more comfortable. And hopefully, if you make it more comfortable, more people will stick with it when they're first confronted with it. I'm sure many of you have had the experience, what, that thing? I'll never wear that, right? And we want to avoid that reaction if we can. Get you to try it at least long enough to see if it helps. And then in the long term, make it more acceptable so you don't give it up. You say, well, yeah, I feel better, but it isn't worth it. We don't want that reaction. We want you to stick with it, okay? Especially if you've been improved initially. And then there is this big question, which is going to underlie a lot of what I say next, which is it true that if I lower the pressure, it's going to be more comfortable? It seems like it ought to be. But as you probably know, a lot of things that we think are true turn out to be worth investigating. We're not sure. So is higher pressure more uncomfortable? Well, you'd think it would be. So a lot of the early attempts were, let's get the lowest possible pressure that works. And then, of course, this is more for a different audience. How do you measure that therapy is, more comfortable and so on? Ultimately, we want to show that more people wear it and more people wear it longer. Those are the metrics, the things we measure. So when we have a new enhancement to CPAP, we ultimately have to answer the question, does it make more people succeed in wearing it, and do they wear it longer? That's what is being done by the scientists who are studying CPAP whenever a new form of CPAP comes out. Okay? And, okay, so what am I going to talk about after this rather lengthy introduction? Well, I've talked about CPAP. You've all heard the term BiPAP. BiPAP is actually a trade name. Its generic form is bi-level, means two different pressures. We'll talk a little about that. There's a variety of things which I've loosely called compensated pressure waveform. Fancy word. It goes under different names. C-flex is the one you're most likely to have heard about. They were kind of the first ones to talk about this. There's EPR. There's a bunch of other variations on this idea. But the key is a concept I'll discuss a little bit so you understand what they're trying to do and what we know about how it does or doesn't work. Auto adjust. The brand names, again, are very, very different with each company, but they all have something that suggests auto in there. And the idea behind it, I'll get into that a little bit, and how it does or does not contribute to this whole thing. Finally, a thing which I was involved in developing, I'd like to show you sort of the thinking behind it. And then, if we have time, I brought along two other things, just in fairness, to show you that not everything is CPAP. There are two new directions that people are looking at. They probably are not as ultimately universally effective as CPAP, but they have a place, and there's active research going on in domains. But they're related to pressure. There are a lot. I'm not going to talk about all the other treatments out there, but I'm just talking about varying the pressure and how we can try and make the CPAP better in the sense of more comfortable, more acceptable. So let's start with BiPAP. It was invented by a guy named Mark Sanders. He's a rather remarkable guy. He was working very closely with Respironics in the early days and helped to put CPAP on the map. And he just started thinking about it, and he came up with a very interesting thought based on that very simple model that I started. And he basically said, well, look, if the problem is that you suck shut the airway and you need the pressure during inspiration, why give it all the time? Why give it during expiration at all. Since from our little model, we said during expiration, you're actually blowing the airway bigger. And you don't need pressure. So maybe it would be more comfortable, since a lot of people complain about difficulty exhaling. He said, well, I don't need it then, so why give it? So he said, well, if I had a good way of telling where the patient is in his breathing cycle, let me give CPAP at one level during inspiration and at a lower level during expiration. And that's two pressures, and so he called it BiPAP. Okay, and you really shouldn't use the term BiPAP for the other manufacturers. It's kind of like Scotch tape, you know. If you don't happen to be the 3M company, you don't want people to use the word Scotch tape. But it's gotten in there, and you'll find it in all sorts of places. This is breathing, okay, here. And CPAP would be a straight line. What's happening in bilevel is during inspiration, which is the peaks of these, the pressure would be up here, and it would be going up and down like a kind of a square wave, like that, okay? And that's what's happening in bilevel. Now, the idea was very simple. Lower it during expiration. So people tried it, and they did very few studies, but they did some studies, and they said, well, do people like one better than the other? CPAP versus constant pressure, because that was the ultimate test. And surprisingly enough, there were people who liked one better, but about an equal number both ways when you switch them. And no one to date has ever shown that bilevel, in any of its forms, is accepted by more people than CPAP. And that if you give people a choice, the majority of people do perfectly well on both, of course, in terms of getting treatment. But you pay an interesting price for adjusting the bilevel, and that is that the lower pressure basically has to be at the same pressure as CPAP. You can make the other pressure as high as you want, but you can't do what it intended to do, which was to keep the high pressure at the CPAP and drop the other one. So if your prescription is for 10 of CPAP, your BiPAP prescription might be 15 and 10, but it won't be 10 and 5. And that's been studied and shown in most cases. Now again, the data is scanty, but to my knowledge, there's nobody who actively contests that observation. In fact, if you read the titration procedure, the reason BiPAP is still around is not that it solved the problem that it was intended for, but rather that it has a spectacular use in another set of patients who need active breathing assistance. These are patients usually who have muscular problems or deformities of the chest wall like kyphoscoliosis, where breathing has to be helped. And so what you want to do is you want to give them high pressure during inspiration to force the air in and then let them breathe out. It's different from obstructive sleep apnea. Interestingly enough, it overlaps, so some people have both. So bilevel is around for these people, not for obstructive apnea. And I teach, although it's a rather radical absolute statement, that it doesn't have any place in obstructive sleep apnea, except as a last resort. If that's what it takes to get you to wear it, so be it. I'm always willing to accept sort of what works. But I don't use it in obstructive sleep apnea until really I'm pretty much at the end of trying everything else. There are people who differ with me and who use it a lot more easily. There was a period when it was used a lot, but the data doesn't support that it actually achieves that purpose that it was set out for. And again, I don't mean to discourage anybody who's using it. If you're using it, it was prescribed, it's not doing any harm. And if it gets you to wear it, I'm all for it. But there's a difference between that and saying that physiologically it's beneficial.